Origins of American Government, Philosophers' Contributions. How did the founders learn about government? They learned about government from reading, history and philosophy, and from their own experiences with self-government as colonists within the British Empire. The first philosopher, Aristotle, was a Greek philosopher and scientist born in 384 BC. He studied under Plato, another great philosopher. He tutored Alexander the Great and wrote a book called Politics. He considered the city to be a natural community and even more important than the family. He believed in natural laws. Society should be governed by certain ethical principles. The government shouldn't disrespect its citizens. Aristotle distinguished between types of government based on the number of persons exercising power. Countries may be governed by one person, a few, or many.
After the Revolutionary War and before this great big building was built, the Founding Fathers all got together to discuss what type of government to establish. They considered 4 types altogether: the monarchy, the oligarchy, the aristocracy, and the democracy. Now, you probably already know which one they picked, but it's also important to know which ones they didn't.
A monarchy is a form of government in which hereditary rulers, that's people who share the same bloodline, better known as kings and queens, wield absolute power over everybody. If a king or queen has absolute power, it means they can do pretty much whatever they want.
All the land to the west of the hills shall be yours.
Oh, but darling, I plan to use all the land to the west for my cricket matches.
Oh. Off with his head.
Since the founders knew that monarchy didn't really fly in the American colonies, what with the King of England being an old wet blanket, other forms of government were carefully considered.
There was the oligarchy. An oligarchy is made up of a body of individuals possessing high levels of wealth, social or military status, or achievement. And there was aristocracy. Aristocracy is ruled by a privileged few.
Now, as nice as monarchies, oligarchies, and aristocracies sound, part of the whole reason the descendants of the Founding Fathers left Europe in the first place was to avoid government structures that left little or no popular consent to the people. So they decided to set up a 4th type of government known as democracy.
A democracy is a form of government in which people hold the power to rule themselves. There are 2 main types of democracy. There's direct democracy and indirect democracy.
In a direct democracy, the people all get together and have an equal say in the laws they create. So, in a direct democracy, majority rules. Kind of like when people get together to have a town meeting and vote on whether to build a playground or a nuclear power plant.
In an indirect democracy, which is also known as representative democracy, people vote for representatives who work on their behalf to create laws. In an indirect democracy, each citizen gets 1 vote. Once chosen, these representatives then vote within a government structure in order to make and pass laws. This is a 2-step version of democracy.
The Founding Fathers of our country decided to go with an indirect democracy. After all, they figured that at some point in time, America would become a really big nation. And if that happened, there'd be no way they could possibly get everyone together in order to facilitate direct rule.
So, indirect democracy it is. But there's a little more to it than just making that decision. The Founding Fathers also had to decide what they wanted in a democracy. Let's take a look at the results.
Types of government. Monarchy. Hereditary rulers, kings and queens, they have absolute power. Oligarchy. Body of individuals having high levels of wealth, social or military status, or achievement. Aristocracy is ruled by a privileged few. Democracy. People hold the power to rule themselves. Democracies can take many forms. In small societies, direct rule is possible. An example of that would be Athens, Greece. In larger societies, the people usually elect representatives to conduct government on their behalf. For instance, the Romans or the United States. We have either a democratic republic or representative democracy. Social contract theory. This is an agreement among the members of an organized society or between the governed and the government, defining and limiting the rights and duties of each. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke were both social contract theorists. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher in the late 1500s and early 1600s. His book Leviathan establishes the social contract theory. The state of nature would be constant war, therefore we must establish government to have a sense of order. John Locke was also an English philosopher who lived in the 1600s. He was an Enlightenment thinker who wrote 2 treatises that laid out his political theory. He believed that human nature is characterized by reason and tolerance, but all men are prone to being selfish. Everyone has the right to defend life, health, liberty, and possessions. People create a civil society to resolve conflicts in a civil way. He also advocated separation of powers and believed that revolution is an obligation under some circumstances. The founders of American government relied on Locke's philosophy to justify declaring independence, and much of Locke's language is also found in the Constitution.
Way back, the ancient Greeks had a lot of time on their hands. When they weren't thinking of sneaky ways to fool the Trojans or inventing science, they busied themselves by tossing around some pretty neat ideas about governments. You may have heard of a guy named Aristotle. He was alive around 350 BC. Aristotle came up with a groovy idea called natural law. Aristotle's theory of natural law holds that society should be governed by certain ethical principles.
When we say ethical principles, we're talking about all the things you should or shouldn't do in society. Aristotle figured that it really wasn't right for a government to disrespect its citizens. So, based on Aristotle's ethical principles, it wasn't right for a government to come in and take over a citizen's land or steal his leaning posts.
Aristotle's concept that governments should respect individual citizens was rather groundbreaking. But it was unfortunate for the citizens that Aristotle's principles didn't top the charts until centuries after their rockin' debut. After the Greeks and Aristotle, things were stagnant in government development for hundreds of years.
But then the 18th century rolled around and things really started hopping. A bunch of Europeans started making waves with some new revolutionary ideas. We call this period in history the Age of Enlightenment. It took place during the 16 and 1700s.
Stop and listen!
During the Age of Enlightenment, philosophers and a handful of other smart folks went around encouraging people to seek alternatives to oppressive governments. Those governments that interfered with the personal rights of its citizens. Bad government, bad.
In response, heavy thinkers began to argue a new idea called popular consent. Popular consent asserts that people should be able to participate directly in the governing of their own societies.
One of those heavy thinkers we mentioned was John Locke. Locke took the idea of popular consent a step further and developed it into what is known as the social contract theory. The social contract theory compares the relationship between a society and its citizens to parties entering into a contract.
Basically, Locke argued that all individuals are naturally free. Therefore, people give their consent when they become members of a society. And if a society's government breaks this contract by acting improperly, then the people have the right to revolt. In fact, Locke said that not only do citizens have a right to revolt, they also have a duty to revolt. Pretty radical, huh?
And if a population rebels and breaks its contract with an ill-behaved government, they have the right to start a new, kinder, gentler government. And that's pretty much what happened here in America.
But first, the Founding Fathers still had some pretty tough decisions to make. The Founders knew that a new government was needed, but what type should they choose? Well, let's find out about some of their options.
For homework, you have a choice of either interpreting this painting, how does this picture represent a social contract, or you can Answer the response. Write a half-page response to the following quote as it relates to government. In order to be free, one must be chained.
Students and staff, this is Dr. Crum. I'd like to prepare us for dismissal today. Please hold your kids until we call for the grade levels to come down. We'll be calling for 3rd, 4th, and 5th first, and we'll go with 8, 7, 6. I do not anticipate us being as late as yesterday, but at this current time we have 5